Okay. Welcome everybody. I'm back with another stream. I have a great guest today. I just want to check my audio and I'll introduce our guest in a moment. Yeah, I think we're good. Very good. Okay. I'm here with Bosco from Saints and Scholars. Some of you may know Bosco. He's been on the go a long time. He's got, I would say, probably the best Substack really coming out of Ireland at the moment. Last year, he's been doing some really interesting work. He obviously runs a Telegram channel called Saints and Scholars, along with that Substack. And I'm going to allow him to just briefly introduce what his kind of project is about. And tonight we're going to get into a really interesting area which we're both very interested in, really. And it's very current. It's very much to do with kind of what's going on in the world today. And the theme will be skepticism and conspiracy in current times. So I'd like to introduce Bosco and allow him to just explain a little bit about his project, about Saints and Scholars and what it's about, and then we'll start our discussion. So how are you, Bosco?
Hey, Don. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure.
So, our channel is Saints and Scholars, as you said. We're primarily on Telegram. It began with myself, Credilytics, and Marcus, three of us. And again, we're just three ordinary blokes. And the channel is really dedicated to Catholicism, but also nationalism. We're all nationalists. And we just think that any political movement needs a very strong foundational story. And if you look out throughout Irish history, and I was only commenting with you earlier on about a Father James O'Hegarty who was martyred in Donegal during the penal times. He had been in a cave, he was giving the sacraments, whatever, and he was brutally killed. And that is a part of our legacy, whether some people like it or not. Maybe we can discuss that aspect at a later date. But ultimately, my Substack then is kind of a bit more open insofar as I get into a lot of kind of jurisprudence. It's an area that I'm very interested in. Jurisprudence being the philosophy of law, especially kind of the epistemological side of it, how we know the law, but also kind of adjacent phenomena. And one of those is kind of conspiracy. So I just wrote an article there a couple of weeks ago on conspiracy. And I think that's what we're going to hone in on today.
Indeed, yeah. That's kind of, well, there's several things I'd love to get into, but I thought that was when we were just planning this out, we had originally planned to do this a while ago, but it just didn't happen for various reasons. And I've been keeping up with your written output, and you did this essay about 2 weeks ago on conspiracy, and we're definitely going to talk about that and the themes in it tonight. And I think one of the things we kind of brought up earlier on when we were kind of saying what planning what we're going to do, was this idea that we're kind of there's a lot of difficulty that people are having to kind of make sense of reality, particularly since the last 5 years with the COVID thing and all the stuff that happened, and there's been an explosion of alternative voices and skepticism. And skepticism is like a foundational kind of thing. It's necessary. It's necessary for us to basically be able to make sense of the world. If you're not skeptical of information, if you're not testing, if you're not measuring, if you're not judging reality, then you can't really make sense of anything. And I think there's a form of radical skepticism has kind of swept over the kind of nationalist sphere in a way. We're kind of part of that, whether we like it or not. Like the conspiracy scene has kind of enveloped nationalism almost, and people are kind of looking for an explanation for what happened, quote unquote. What is wrong, and we kind of tend to select some particular episode in history as like that's the point. This is when it went wrong, or this is the group that's at fault, or there's an elite. There's always an idea of an elite, and of course there are elites. I wouldn't dispute that. But I think that the recent kind of tendency is to throw away all kind of foothold, and you've nothing left. And so you have these kinds of new figureheads who kind of come forward, whether it's like a David Icke or whatever, and he kind
Mm,
of fills that space with like something that's like oppositional to the current thing,
yes.
but which kind of leaves you debased almost.
Yeah,
Even you
I
can
mean,
say the right
you're
things.
100% right because and we've discussed this off air, so to speak, but ultimately one can almost understand it because a lot of institutions that were hitherto kind of trustworthy uh, have ultimately, soured themselves. And that's a sad reality. Even things like science, even during the COVID, trust the science. And people fell for a slogan kind of or being incapable of kind of really differentiating between science, which is a methodology, and an ethical kind of prescription, which is trust the science. Now, I don't think anybody has an issue with trusting science as a methodology. People do have an issue with trusting scientists who frame science and have vested interests. And I think that's sadly, people are saying, well, they'll throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that can be very dangerous. I can understand from a psychological, spiritual point of view, but it can be very dangerous too, because as you said, people can be almost, people talk about kind of going down rabbit holes. I prefer to use kind of snakes and ladders because you can travel up with a ladder, but then unwittingly you can find yourself being, even below the ladder with a snake, and people just fall into rabbit holes that are darker and have way even less substance than the tunnel that they try to evacuate from.
Yeah, yeah, I do feel that. I feel that like with the COVID thing as well. I think there was an over. I think people were not skeptical enough in some respects of the alternative media as
Mm,
well. You know, there was no one really holding them to account. You know, there was a lot of different competing narratives, and even with nationalism, even if you get away from that kind of whole area, even if you just talk about like mass immigration or any of these issues, there's a kind of a tendency to look for like, what this is the. And in fairness, I investigate these things, so I am looking for institutions and players and
mm,
what's the word, influential people
mm,
who hold power, because I genuinely, my approach is that there is a power. There's people hold power.
mm,
A lot of my idea about how the world works is that there is a power structure there. It has a kind of a logic to how it operates, and I think liberal democracy is kind of a shield almost for power. So that's kind of a conspiracy. There's almost liberal democracy is, in my view, is almost a conspiracy itself. And I think this actually could be feeding a lot of the unease, and because people sense there's something kind of illegitimate about a lot of the processes
mm,
that we're asked to go through, with these referendums, who's calling the referendum on what purpose. We're always being manipulated by propaganda. There's a lot of PR management, image management. If you look at like how people are presented in the media, that's an image. You
mm,
have influencer culture now. That's the new media. People present a kind of an image. They create a lifestyle. They cultivate an image for the masses, for mass consumption, and they target a niche, just like any marketer would. And it takes away the kind of purity you might think exists like with objective truth. So you're kind of looking at someone is marketing an idea to you, but you don't really know how genuine it all is, because everyone is trying to sell you something. Everyone is trying to market something.
yeah.
Um,
No,
and I think, yeah,
100%. I mean, it seems to be very curated, as you said.
yeah,
And if I may kind of introduce something here, I don't know if you ever heard of a theorist called Stephen Lukes, ironically, a leftist.
no,
That still doesn't mean that we can't use his information and his research. And he wrote a book called Power, a Radical View. And he goes in that book, he kind of explains about power isn't just about kind of winning an argument. He suggests that power has three faces or even dimensions, moving from the most obvious to the most invisible, shall I say. And this is connected, you see, with conspiracy, because as you rightly said there, Don, people assume things to be organic. When you peel away the veil, you find that it's not organic at all. It's like astroturfing. A lot of people think democracy is, oh yeah, we all participate in democracy. But when you discover actually that the culture is seeded in order to give back what is expected to be given back, you realize that it's all a sham. Take the abortion referendum. That was certainly curated, that was certainly seeded. And people gave back, you had the Citizens' Assembly, for example, Stephen Lukes would ask kind of, which is the second phase of power, it's called agenda setting. Who decided that that should be on the agenda? Well, that in itself is an indication of power that people don't have a say in. And ultimately, these things are taken for granted. And of course, even the Citizens' Assembly is taken in a direction that is very, very manipulated. And then, of course, you've got the journalism in Ireland is effectively dead, neutral journalism, if there can be such a thing, because ultimately, and stop me if I'm ranting here, but there was a reporter that was captured during one of the protests, and I recall him saying that I'm not part of the story. I'm just here to make or to represent the story. Yet the very fact that his editor and whoever else was there told him to go or to prioritize this event over any other potential other event is itself an ideological decision. And once you start to uncover this, uncover the veil, you start to realize that uh, there are conspiracies at work. And that's why effectively I wrote about kind of the mythology about conspiracies, because when you hear someone, a normie, they'll often give a caricature about conspiracies, that a conspiracy is a load of people in this boardroom and they'll ask for evidence. But that's just a caricature.
Yeah, and that's almost a manufactured idea itself. The idea of the smoky room, the guy puffing the cigar, and the dark room, and everyone sitting around the table, and it's all implied that this is money and power, and in reality, we all kind of we're a part of informal conspiracies ourselves.
That's right.
Like the narratives, the stories, like someone marketing you a story. A lot of media is now basically just PR, and I mean, even if a lot of them maybe believe that they're actually just engaged in honest reporting. It's like you say, if you're being sent to cover a particular topic, there's an inbuilt kind of frame in which you're supposed to cover that topic,
That's right.
and there's a set of values and attitudes that are prevalent in modernity in the West, and that's the progressive ethos. I mean, that's ultimately is a power system of power and
That's right.
projection that's been projected onto all through the instruments of the media and the state. It's pressed onto everyone's kind of conscience, and we don't really learn to think outside of it, even though they talk a lot about creativity and independent voices and the free West. I mean, but ultimately, like the West is in a lot of the delusion about how free it is.
Yeah, and I've discussed this with a mutual friend about the use of the what is called the enthymeme in journalism, and that's a hidden premise. For example, they'll often beg the question of the far right without ever substantiating that claim in the first place, because it's rhetorical. That's not journalism, that's propaganda. And sadly, we have no media, and this is where the element of conspiracy comes in. Because if I may give I before most of the content that I write, I kind of give a bit of a story to kind of to establish what I'm going to say in a more kind of narrative setting. And I give the example of jeans manufacturers and conspiracy. Now, people might say, "Where am I going with this?" But if you bear with me, uh, when you think of a pair of jeans, right, they're built from a robust material, denim. They have rivets. They're notoriously good for lasting. And just say you have a pair of bootcut denim jeans. They're all in fashion. And you've a jeans company or corporation selling jeans. Well, the very nature of the jeans means that they're robust. They're not going to fail very easily because of the nature of how they're constructed. Well, the jeans company will ask itself, or its board will ask itself, okay, we've exhausted now. the number of bootcut genes that we can sell because they're so robust, and that's part of our selling spiel that they are robust. So how on earth are we going to increase our sales? And this is where they co-opt the fashion industry because they'll say, listen, what we'll do, we'll manufacture an advertising campaign, a marketing campaign that says tapered jeans or flared jeans or stonewashed jeans, whatever, is the new trend. So what happens is they devise a very sophisticated campaign. They adopt kind of, or they utilize celebrities who, especially young people, might emulate, try to emulate, and so suddenly these genes go out, and then you've got this is where the organic nature of, I think, the conspiracy that I focused on, which is kind of an opportunistic, convergent form of conspiracy. And this is where effectively influential people, you mentioned influencers, but in my day it might be kind of the college jock or the cheerleader, shall I say, trope in America. The popular person starts to wear the jeans because they're fashion conscious. And then you've got kind of people, shall I say, on a kind of who look up to the local, heartthrob or whatever, try to emulate their kind of local hero, shall I say. And they start saying, well, Mary or John is wearing these jeans. They're the new fashion. So I'm going to dispense and throw out my bootcut jeans, which are perfectly fine. And they start to buy tapered jeans. And this is how the fashion industry go. Now, this is a form of conspiracy because to conspire is just to a group to come together to pursue a certain activity. Now, in its most narrow sense, it's always to do with an illegal act, but that's assumptive already because there's a lot of things that are legal in our country at the moment that doesn't necessarily mean they're right because ultimately we've moved from natural law to positivism, which means that the law is right no matter what foundations are behind it. It's might over right. So ultimately, you've got conspiracies everywhere. But again, the only conspiracy that people tend to be aware of is called the wheel conspiracy. And that's where everybody's, in the know that even those at the bottom strata of the conspiracy, they've had access to this murky boardroom. But that's not how most conspiracies work. Some work insofar as something is set in motion, it could be organic, and then people co opt something that is very, very beneficial. And I suppose that's what I kind of was getting at.
Yeah, I mean that's actually a good introduction to what I was going to like. Actually, you're reminding me of like over the last few weeks, like just to kind of relate it to. That's a good analogy, of course, you drew there, but it reminds me of what I've been covering for the last couple of weeks on the streams I was doing, which was this idea of the open government. Uh, what's it called? The open government, the OGP partnership, the open government partnership, and it's that whole the origin of that whole movement, which it is a movement basically internationally. It actually comes out of decades of collaborative effort on behalf of many different organizations, and many of which wouldn't necessarily be in alignment on all things. It's like there's libertarian minded tech bros, and they're very much about, and I'm kind of like that, and that I want, open access technology, open source. You want access to data about the government, about what they're doing, how they're spending money, how they're allocating everything, and those kinds of libertarian idealists are also working ultimately in collaboration with the U.S. Department of State, which is engaged in all kinds of conspiratorial activities all over the world, which uses open technology to foment revolution. Like I think I could assume, based on what I've seen, that that's what we're seeing a lot of, perhaps in Iran
Yeah.
in recent weeks. But the classic example that twigged me onto all this years ago was back in like the Syrian situation with Assad and Libya with Gaddafi and the Arab Spring. And, you know, on one level, the proponents of that regime change will say that wasn't a regime change. What that was a democratic uprising, and we merely provided the technology and the
Yes.
means by which the people could overthrow their, violent, theocratic, or despotic, maybe not theocratic in the case of some of them, but they're despotic anyway, um, leaderships, and install democracy. And the response will be, you're a conspiracy theorist because you documented certain actions and certain connections. So what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll train the students. Generally, it's the students they get to protest because there'll be some organic kind of youthful vigor in the students, and they'll be, more liberal, and they'll be inclined to say, oh, I don't like the stuffy autocratic regime and I want freedom.
Mm.
And train them. And one of the people they use, one of the manuals they use is called uh what's that guy's name? From Freedom to Democracy is the book, and that was written in the 80s, and it was in the 80s that they started doing all this. But the people who were doing this, who were managing, so there's all these moving parts. There's all kinds of money flowing through, fronts for the State Department, such as the National Down for Democracy, and dozens of NGOs connected to that in various ways. But the people who are managing it on some level, they're managing various parts of this, have this kind of plausible deniability to say, well, we're not actually interfering, we're just enabling, we're just allowing what should happen to play out, and it's not a conspiracy. And they'll say you're spreading Russian propaganda, or for example, if you were to point that out, that they've done this across every, state basically,
Yeah.
bordering Russia in the last 20 years.
Exactly. And the thing is, even going back to that analogy of the genes, just say the cheerleader or the jock or whatever, they're not technically co-conspirators in the sense that they're aware of the originating conspiracy, but they are unwitting conspirators because they are promoting or encouraging the conspiracy. And that's the problem with a lot of people. People think that unless you provide this murky boardroom example of a wheel conspiracy, that there is no conspiracy at all. In fact, this is a major play because I've often said, Don, if just say hypothetically, a bit of a silly hypothetical, but just say a fir tree was significant, okay? And I asked you, where's the best place to hide a fir tree? In a fir tree forest, right? It's out in the open, it's visible, right? And I believe that a lot of theories, because of human nature, a lot of information eventually makes its way out into the public. Well, the best way in order to safeguard against that is to discredit all conspiracies as bogus, despite the fact that the information is in front of our eyes. And there's many ways of doing that. You either discredit the person saying it, or you do it in a general way, saying, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory. And of course, we know where that came from. And that was during the Warren Commission. And again, it was about kind of no matter what anybody came up with, it was given this device, and people tend to shortcut their reason and say, oh, sure, conspiracy theory, let's throw that out the window. It's the same with PSYOP, because if you overutilize PSYOP, everything's a PSYOP, which means even the PSYOP is a PSYOP. So you end up in this kind of,
Ironically, that's the most likely scenario, that
yeah,
the
exactly.
psyop conspiracy is a psyop to get you to
That's
start
right.
doubting all reality, so that anytime we want to do something, you just think it's all fake. Like we saw that a lot.
Exactly.
The great example of that is there was that Richard D. Hall who was, he was prosecuted and brought. And although I didn't actually think it was fair in a way, but look, I mean, there's people who have kind of come out and said, like, well, he's entitled to say that, and I agree, he's entitled to make his case,
Mm,
but there's a group of people who, whenever anything like that happens, like any kind of horrible terrorist attack or something like that, shooting or whatever, they basically, the first reaction is to say it's a psyop,
that's right.
and the only people who would benefit from this is the state. So they're making this a reality. That this is not those. This guy isn't a real Muslim, or he's, he drank alcohol, so he's not a real Muslim, so he couldn't have done this. And
Right.
that kind of speaks to a cultural naivety that we have an idea of what a Muslim should be. So
Yeah.
if he drank alcohol once, that means that he wouldn't do it or whatever. And these are kind of flawed thought patterns. This is a way of thinking which actually doesn't follow. And I noticed with the thing with the Manchester, for maybe I shouldn't even say it on YouTube, but the thing that happened in Manchester that
Yeah.
Paul wrote about, um, you know, like I've seen footage of this, and the people who say it didn't happen will say, "Well, you can't prove that this happened." And well, to that I would say, well, what actual evidence have you got other than you're just casting doubt? You're saying there's doubt about certain facts, and that's fine. It's fine to have doubt about certain facts, but you have to produce other facts which are
Mm.
more likely to be true.
Correct.
And so a lot of this just relies on skepticism, and skepticism is a necessary feature of all thought. All coherent thought has to have
Mm.
skepticism. You
Mm.
cannot be so accepting of every piece of information that you receive that you believe everything, and yet you have to be able to basically, um, you have to have a level of skepticism, to be able to think. And it's actually a driver of every development really in Western thought has been skepticism. There was a skeptical crisis. I've been reading about this for the next kind of part of the globalist education series, which will have a little bit about skepticism in it as a driver of various parts of the Enlightenment and of the emergence of modern science. Basically, was skepticism. It's not as simple as people think. Like, it's just, we know we were all theologically based, and then we became scientific, and we discovered all of
Mm.
us. This is this is the propaganda of the Enlightenment, is
Mm.
that we're all ignorant, and then all of a sudden we became enlightened and started believing in science. Which
Mm.
is just a total, it's such a ridiculous simplification that it's a lie. It doesn't, it bears no relation to reality. But skepticism does have this, like, skepticism was used, for example, by the church even to critique, you know, um,
Galileo.
new, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly, and new theology, and
That's right.
then to critique the real skeptics, because there was genuine skeptics who wouldn't believe anything, who basically
Exactly.
said, I cannot believe anything. That, so in a way, they're like the earlier version of what we have now, which is that there's people online who just will not believe anything ever happened. You know?
Exactly. You have to be rigorous and you have to assess even the most ludicrous. You cannot dismiss any claim. And I say you assess a claim on its own merits and then you dismiss it because you need a methodology. And the problem today is because of this short circuiting, where, and let's be honest, the most ludicrous examples or representations of conspiracies tends to make it on television. So again, you're going to get the normie who'll go, ah, but sure, all these people are nuts. Therefore, a more cogent or valid conspiracy that's out there will be dismissed because this person will short circuit and say, I'm not listening to any of these conspiracy nuts. But that's a way of discrediting. And I think people really, that's why even kind of what people might say are harmless theories, they can actually be fairly harmful for a movement like nationalism because if you're putting out garbage and there's people who are maybe at a point in their life saying, hang on, there's something amiss here. Maybe I need to maybe I need to hear what these people have to say. But if they come up against someone who's put out something really ridiculous, sadly, a lot of those people say, okay, I've heard enough. These people are nuts, and go back to, to the status quo where they were before. And that's why it's imperative that our side really, really kind of remain rational. Uh, so,
Yeah, there's an absence of that, I think, in recent years. Like, there's been a major issue, I think, with like the blending of the, like, I think COVID was the big, like, inflection point where you had these two kind of different movements. Like, one was the kind of nationalist movement, and then there was the, what used to be called, anyway, maybe it's not called that anymore, but it used to be called the what was it called, the truth movement. That was it, the truth
yes.
movement. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember the truth movement, like, because, I don't know about you, but I was kind of following these things, like, over the years. I dip in and out of these kinds of things, and there was different fads that came and went. I
Mhm.
remember, like, 9/11 was the big one originally. In a way, that's kind of the foundation of it, in a sense, in the modern time. But, like, I've always been very interested in the Kennedy assassination, for example. I've always kind of read books about it and listened to different theories about it, and I do think there is a conspiracy there of
Mm.
sorts.
Mm.
And then the 9/11 happened. That kind of really shook a lot of people's reality, you know.
Well, we
And
know from a point of certainty, due to kind of the historical record, that there was, Operation Northwood. And when you think of it, that was during the Kennedy administration, where one of the generals had proposed as a pretext to invade Cuba, that there'd be bombings, or maybe I shouldn't say that online. There'd be certain things on, throughout America. Uh, Killings Americans and blaming it on the Cubans. Now, from my understanding, JFK was completely intolerant of that view because he said we're not sacrificing innocent Americans. But what I took from that is that there are people in very high places, like this was a four-star general, and I think he went on to become uh, commander in chief of NATO forces in Western Europe.
mm,
So, like, if
yeah,
someone can, and no doubt, if it goes to the president, it's been spoken at lower levels as well. So
yeah,
the very fact that it was actually presented to a sitting president suggests to me, like we know from the Israeli conflict, the Hannibal Directive,
hmm
that there are people out there willing to, it's like, the end justifies the means.
and this is
So
why it's important to be precise and to hold your fire, so to speak, metaphorically, like until you have a real kind of case, maybe with some of these things, you know. And there's,
exactly.
you know, it's like a very lucrative career now to be a conspiracy theorist. If you're willing to kind of entertain, I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind is the Macron thing with the potential transgender thing. Um, with Candace Owens and everything, which is a, you know, in a very kind of outlandish kind of. Well, I've actually, it's very interesting to hear about it. I understand why people find it interesting, you know, but like this kind of stuff is uh people are making careers out of it now, and a lot of the people who were banned off of YouTube years ago have
Mm,
been replaced by a whole new cast of people who are now monetizing all the
that's
stuff that it was illegal to say that you couldn't say.
right.
And I often wonder, is that deliberate? Is that actually the real conspiracy? Is to basically pollute the landscape with so many confusing narratives? You know, and you see it with the Kennedy thing too, and 9/11. You know, there was no planes, and with Kennedy, it was the driver turned around and shot him, and that was the great kind of ridiculous one. Which, you know, and then there was the one that his own wife shot him. Even there was a conspiracy theory like that. You know,
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
you
it
know,
is. Like, I mean, it's about poisoning the well because I think a lot of these guys are fairly clued in. They have a lot of money behind them, a lot of research. It's like Google with manipulating people to use their products. I mean, you've got people addicted to phones. That's not by chance, it's by design. And ultimately, like, you are right that there's a kind of this poisoning of the well. And ultimately, what does that do? But it benefits people who are aware that information will eventually leak out. That's just the human condition
yeah,
because it requires a lot of actors, really. And look at the USS Liberty, for example, right? There's an abundance of information there, right? Evidence to prove that it was the Israelis.
yeah,
Despite that, though, everybody lumps conspiracies into one bag, or should they're all a conspiracy, inverted commas, as if no conspiracy has been proven as a fact. We know that's false because there's conspiracies all the time. Like, as I said, the example of the fashion industry. And like the same with kind of false flags. They'll go, oh, you and your false flag. Well, again, we know from the historical record that there have been false flags. We know the Bay of Tonkin. Is it the Gleichwitz in, the pretext to German invasion of Poland?
mm,
We have, there's numerous ones.
yeah,
And so again, like the key is kind of, and what the media apparatus rely on this poisoning of the well. So people will either give up, or people will start chasing or going down rabbit holes after absolutely nothing when the obvious is in their face.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, just to take it back to what we were kind of how we got into this kind of tangent here. You know, the blending of this kind of radical skeptic kind of truth so-called movement, you know,
Mm,
with nationalism. Um, you know, it really occurred really with the COVID thing, and that was like the major kind of inflection point where a lot of the like all of a sudden you have to have a very strong opinion on what even if a vaccine or even if a sorry not a vaccine even if a virus is real, and people are making this very strident claim that there's no such thing as viruses, and anyone that could be otherwise a perfectly reasonable person says, I'm not sure about that now. Oh, they're a shill. You're a shill. Anyone that disagrees with your
That's
particular
right.
framing, and that's not actually representative of reality. Like
Mm.
in society, everyone who votes for the current government, probably has a whole list of things that they would disagree on. If you put them into a room with two random people who voted Fine Gael, I guarantee you, like, you'd find them saying all kinds of things that they don't even like about the government. But people don't vote for, they're not rational, and it's totally almost antisocial to be like that, where you're so intolerant that you just cannot think that someone might just disagree. And if they disagree with my pet theory, all cannot be. We can't move forward, and that's it. All must be thrown out. And that
Exactly. And
mindset has really damaged, I think, a lot of the momentum that nationalism should basically have, which is a simple philosophy at its heart. We have to put the Irish people first. We have to basically come up with a coherent governmental idea of what we want to do policy wise, and we have to pursue that. But people get kind of bogged down in, like, trying to prove that there was so many people died based on RIP.ie data or whatever. And if you don't agree with this exact thing that I'm saying, even though you might think over the scam or whatever, and I kind of do in a way as well, but it's just there's just all these narratives that if you don't agree with one piece of this, you're finished. You're
that's
dead to me. And
yeah.
what can you do with that?
Yeah, it's very difficult, and like we were discussing off air there, that there has to be some kind of intellectual humility. That if I put out stuff, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just saying this is my belief. Does anybody else have a comment on it? And I think sometimes movements can be, captured by egotism, and what is lost is the cause. Because for me, anyway, I love Ireland. I'm an Irishman. I'm an Irish nationalist. I'm an Irish patriot. I love this country. And the thing is, whether it's whether I conceive of something to help Ireland or whether it's someone else, as long as it helps Ireland, that should be the motivation. And that's why I think people should be open to thinking. And yeah, there's going to be bad actors, but that's the nature of humanity. That's You just have to adapt. And
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think I do think the there's an unhealthy skepticism which has kind of overtaken things, and I think that's the big problem, is that there's uh, a very narrow people are very narrow, very siloed. You know, People will often say, like, well, I listen to the alt media, so I know, and they always will criticize rightfully the mainstream media and say, well, the mainstream media is telling lies, and I agree. I mean, a lot of the mainstream media is just total garbage, and you know, and just disingenuous narratives, almost borderline defamation in some cases about the characters, impugning the characters of people and everything. But you have to also produce the goods yourself. You cannot
exactly.
criticize the mainstream media and then, like, take every narrative that comes out of the, like, I saw, for example, this last week, just thinking of an obvious example with the Iranian thing. I saw Alex Jones immediately going to, the Iran is rising up, and this is like, I mean, to me, this is a very obvious kind of spook narrative that he's putting out there that is very questionable. And he's, like, a couple of years ago, he would have been saying, this is terrible, and we
Yeah.
need to stop the deep state from overthrowing the Iranian government, because it's not our job to overthrow the Iranian government. I mean, people are criticizing immigration. Well, American regime change in North Africa is the reason we got the 2015 migrant crisis.
Mm,
And I believe that's probably a conspiracy, because they deliberately want to send those people into Europe,
yeah.
through particular channels across the Mediterranean. And but yet a lot of these Trump people have become so. And I know I supported Trump. It's no secret, early on.
Mm,
But a lot of these Trump supporters have become so caught up in a kind of a personality cult that
exactly.
they're not able to basically see themselves anymore, and they're actually taking positions now, which, like, in 2016 would have been completely oppositional. Like, they would have been with Jeb Bush if they had
Mhm.
said these things in 2016. And here Trump is saying these things now because, well, let's be real, he's probably just controlled by Israel. And
Well, there's a kind of an
he
element of it. a sunk cost fallacy with a lot of the MAGA because emotionally they've invested so much that they daren't retract their support. And I suppose not only that, but there has been, like, I speak in a lot of my essays about personal cost and moral conviction. And you'll recognize the difference between moral conviction and performative action or performance is that with real moral conviction, there's a personal cost. And a lot of the MAGA people, in fairness, they've suffered personal costs, whether it's relatives, jobs, whatever. But that takes a toll because if you've suffered a personal cost and you find out that the person that you that warranted that personal cost, as in the belief that you held, and doesn't stand up to it, stand up to scrutiny, well then that creates a kind of you know a dissonance really because part of them probably recognize that there's something amiss, but there's also a part that says, hang on here, I've lost an awful lot.
Yeah.
And
Sunk
I
cost
think
fallacy almost.
exactly. And that's what, and listen, I would say, and I know people, and especially this kind of liberal bourgeoisie, who I've termed the sophistico because they think themselves so sophisticated to have these views. And that's why you'll see, especially in Ireland. For example, there was a case there in the 2000s, early 2000s, and it's still online. Of there was the potential for a refugee accommodation in Ballsbridge, and of course, um, people with money don't have to go out into the streets and protest. They will use lawfare, and they'll use political influence. So anyway, ultimately, planning permission wasn't granted. But you and I know, Don, that these are the same people because of symbolic currency that they'll retrieve or receive because of holding these certain views, that they'll go on about kind of refugees are welcome here. But we know that it's not true, as in morally convicted, because there's no personal cost. It's performance. And I suppose
Exactly.
that's, I might talk to you another day, but I've kind of developed a kind of a theory. But like ultimately, I think people people are very hackable, and I think even with the conspiracy stuff, people need to recognize that there's conspiracies going around all the time. Insofar as look at even the in fact, some of the greatest conspirators are the media, because when you think of it, every journalist cannot just go off willy nilly off his own bat and follow a story. He has to do effectively what his editor says. Okay. And his editor, once he writes it up, his editor will say, well, no, I want it framed X, Y, and Z. And what's his name? Leftist Noam Chomsky wrote about this kind of stuff in Manufacturing Consent. Now, ironically, Chomsky has been
Yeah.
kind of quite
It's
remiss when he applies it to the left wing
it's
media.
actually debatable whether he is kind of a almost a conspiracy himself set out there to kind of mislead people about certain narratives. Go
Exactly.
ahead. Sorry. Go.
But like ultimately, every article that is seen in a newspaper, online, on the news, on TV, is choreographed at some point, right? Because someone has to make the decision that something is newsworthy. Not only newsworthy, but they have to put a certain slant on it. And not only that, but it prioritizes one news item for another because there's finite space for news. So someone has to make a decision what is newsworthy. That's a conspiracy. That is people coming together to manufacture what is important in society.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
yet
and it's
these
often said that the editors actually are the ones with the real kind of power.
exactly, and the ownership, of course.
Mm.
But again, like we have probably the worst journalism. Um, I well, what can I? Perhaps journalism was always like this, but ultimately, if you look back at old reportage, it was kind of effectively a statement of fact, a bare statement of fact. Now is it? Now nearly every reporting contains these, as I said, empty memes, begging the question, slants, um, cherry picking facts. I mean, they're constantly on about kind of, for example, a very good example actually is how the media constantly go on about church uh, control over the schools. Now, this is patently false, right? And I'll explain why. It's patently false because what is the major marker of control? It's reproducibility. So, if you look at all the aspects of the education system in Ireland, it's controlled by the curricula and it's controlled by the state. Now, there's a nominal patronage, but that's all because the state is producing not Catholics, but largely anti Catholics or indifferent Catholics.
Yeah.
That demonstrates that there is no control, but this is a myth. It's a myth.
Yeah, and it is. It's curated through knowledge production, basically through the and it's like the I always go back to Schmidt. Like I think Carl Schmidt basically explains the liberal paradigm perfectly succinctly, basically in political theology, because he's basically saying that power in the liberal society is obfuscated, and that allows for the real power to operate kind of unchecked. And that's what you see with education. You see that the education system is very clearly curated, and people will constantly invoke this like mythology that the church is running this, and we've no, it's terrible that the children are indoctrinated. I mean, I went to school like 30 years ago, and I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't like that then, even. I mean, this is
Yeah,
just
no, listen, I'm a
total
child of
dummy.
the 70s. I mean, listen, you're going to get good and bad everywhere. That's the nature of human nature, right? I went to a boys' national school. There was no priests. And was there corporal punishment? Yeah, but they weren't priests. That was the culture. But the thing is, though, Don, when you look across the West at the time, most of the West had the same level of conservatism.
And they had a state
Even,
church as well
that's right.
in these
That's
places. A lot
right.
of these liberal societies had a state church. You know,
Uber liberal Sweden had, what's it called? Oh, the names escaped me. Um,
Lutheran, wasn't it? I think.
no, there was a practice of, oh, the names escaped me. Do you know where, you stop people from breeding? What's it called?
Oh, eugenics and everything, isn't it?
Yeah, up to
Sterilization.
1970,
Sterilization. You mean? Sorry. Yeah.
sterilization, thank you. Up till 1974, 76. And they had an established church. Ireland never had an established church.
Yeah, and that
They'd
was
had
another thing
a church.
during the week there. I did Ben Burb on Twitter did a good thread. He always seems to write tweets that I want to respond to and add to. You know what I mean? He's just one of those people, like one of the few people on Twitter that's really doing good stuff, like, and always insightful. And he says, or whoever it is, I don't know who it is, but he was talking about that, like, and I made a tweet basically saying that eugenics is inherent to liberal and progressive
That's right.
societies, because
That's right.
it's all evolution. Everything that we're dealing with now is a product of, really, in a way, of evolutionary kind of ways of looking at things. Everything is
That's right.
evolving, everything is changing, and they don't like the biological evolution so much because ever since World War II they're not really racist. But like the point is that, like, there is this evolutionary ideology driving, and it's all about manipulating and cultivating a certain kind of person. So when the progressive says, I want to take religion out of the schools, what they're saying is, I want to install progressive religion into the schools, and you're in the way. And that's what it's about, because no one is acknowledging that they have their own ideology, and it's essentially a political religion. And that's another one of
Exactly.
the people I always go to is Vogelin, because he has this idea of the political religions, and that is that all of these inherently radical political movements, and liberalism is one of them. Liberalism is a radical political movement, basically, and it's basically building on religious concepts, which it's taking, commandeering for its own purposes, and
Mm.
then presenting to you as if it's true. This is objective reality, and that is the nature of liberalism. It's to obfuscate where the power is held, but there are people deciding these policies. There are people in the Department of Education, or in these different quangos, who are doing this, and who are managing these processes. And so it's all about process. That's what Schmidt is on about. Everything is hidden behind process.
That's right.
Liberalism is all about, you get into this process, and, well, we can't, I'm sorry, now, you walk into a meeting. Well, hey, we're managing the meeting, and you put your hand up later and we'll take your input. Your input goes nowhere, because the person who is deciding the final report says, well, that input was racist, so we're not going to count that. and it goes nowhere. And that's what you see, that liberalism is just managed processes that obfuscate where the actual power is. So it's inherently disingenuous as a in its character.
Exactly, and like you're spot on insofar as like liberalism, secularism, it's always framed as something neutral. It's not neutral. It's a worldview which says something about the world. That is not neutrality. That is subjective. They're
Yeah.
imposing something on the world with a view, or with a foundational view. And a lot of people fall for it, and it's almost seen as the de facto neutrality when it's not. And like there's a lot of things that in society at the moment that people think are, the status quo and will always remain the status quo. And one of those things actually is, I was only thinking about this the other day, the notion that prosperity in the West will continue in perpetuity. That's not true. And how do we know it's not true? Because if you actually look at history, not in a kind of a segment of history, which people tend to do, likewise with climate change, they'll take a segment of a graph and then they'll represent that as the whole. But if you look at society, for 99.9% of the time, 99.9% of the people lived in poverty. That's just a verifiable fact. There was always an elite, and according to a lot of economists, we're actually going back there. And we're
Yeah.
going that back there because ultimately there's so many mechanisms that are failing, the currency crisis, debt crisis. And have you ever heard of the kind of anatomy of the what's it called? It's called the elephant curve.
Uh,
And
maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with it anyway. So just
it was
explain it.
developed by an economist called Branko Milanovic. And it kind of provides a visual of how the global economy restructured itself between 88 and 2008. And it kind of maps winners, the losers of globalization. And the graph really ultimately, it's a bit like kind of that old adage of what is a camel but a horse made by committee. And part of this kind of thought experiment is that the back of the elephant are the winners. So that's the massive hump in the middle represents the global middle class. It's but it's ironically it's not in America at all. It's forms part of, or it's derivative of China, India, and Southeast Asia. The trough is kind of the losers, and the biggest dip, of course, uh, are the lower middle and working classes of the West. And of course,
Mhm.
the trunk rather is the super winners, and that's of course we know the global 1%. But like according to Milanovic, like ultimately we are returning to a norm that pre-existed, uh, kind of Western prosperity. And I think there's a historian called what's his name, German guy, Shedile. Is it Walter Shedile? He argued in a book anyway. I think it's The Great Leveler, that throughout history inequality decreases due to mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolution, state failure, and of course, what we all experienced, inverted commas, lethal pandemics. And effectively, the 20th century, these guys are saying, is a blip. It's a blip in history. Prosperity will not continue into perpetuity. And because of mechanization and technology, there's far look at China, for example, the credit system, the social credit system. There's way more opportunity now for an elite to exercise control over the masses. I mean, there was a video going around there of Chinese people living homeless, and the author of the piece said, "Oh, the viewer probably thinks these people are drug addicts or, like likening them to Western homeless. But no, they were ordinary people who, for whatever reason, uh, did not appease the CCP, and their tap to the world was effectively turned off. Like, that's frightening. And that's why we're seeing a lot about the, the digital ID, and you're looking at major increases in kind of uh, tyrannical vectors, shall I say, or vectors of tyranny. You see that in Britain. I think Starmer recently indicated that they're going to bring in legislation. Again, they frame the legislation as protecting young people, but it's effectively saying that we'll interfere in people's privacy. We'll be able to check uh, private phone calls or phone messaging. Like, we are living in fairly dangerous times, and most people don't seem to be aware of it. And most
Yeah.
people aren't aware of it because ultimately they're caught in this kind of um, mass consumerist kind of pylon where all they're interested in, and this is because of atomization and individualization, which I get into my theory, that we're at a kind of point now, an inflection point, to use your word earlier on, that the environment is ripe for manipulation and for tyranny to come back, a neo feudalism, as you will. And the sad reality during the COVID, they know that people are so susceptible to fear that they will hand away fundamental freedoms at a whim. And
Yeah.
not only that, but they're willing to sell out their own family. That you find that. I mean, I don't think we've actually really digested or even kind of scrutinized what happened during the
Yeah.
COVID.
You see, I tell you one thing. I've got a whole theory of my own as well. Like about that, we should do. I could think of about 20 streams off of this one, honestly. But I'll briefly say like. Actually, I'll say first. I'll go back to that in a second. I just want to say, if anyone has any comments, just stick them in the comments on any of the forums you're watching. We have a number of people on Odyssey and Rumble. I think I'll see comments there. And if you're on YouTube, you can use the chat. And if you're on X, which the majority of the audience is, I think if you just make a comment under the video, the live stream as it's on X, I'll should be able to refresh and see that. So I'll try to get to those at the end if anyone wants to ask anything or say anything. But getting back to your point there, you bring up the point about, are we going back into decline? Is this the 20th century is a blip, and are we heading into this kind of neo feudal, nightmare kind of future? That's terrifying to think about, but I believe that a lot of what we're dealing with in the West is the Western elites are attempting to keep the lights on, so to speak.
Exactly.
I mean, if you look at the expenses alone, like just take even without going into kind of nightmare scenarios of like starvation or everything, if you just look at it from a practical point of view of like, well, the demographic situation, we've increased the state to
Mm.
such a scale because we live in this progressive society, which we have this therapeutic state. It's been described as by several people. I think was it Lash? Was that the guy that called?
That's right, Christopher
Yeah,
Lash. Yeah, yeah, I write
yeah,
about him in my thesis.
yeah.
Yeah,
I remember you, and I actually have his book in my hand. I haven't actually got around to reading that book yet.
really interesting,
Fantastic
John.
book,
You should
but, yeah.
try and yeah.
But I've read people who have cited that book, like Paul Gottfried and a couple other people over the years. And essentially, the idea is that the state becomes this therapeutic, rather than a simple liberal political institution in a classical liberal sense, in a kind of traditional republican sense, if you could call it republicanism traditionalism. But in a old style republican system, there's certain levels to which the government can operate, and outside of that, it can't operate. It's supposed to be contained, and it is essentially supposed to, ideally, in the American sense and in the Irish sense too, it's supposed to guarantee the kind of natural rights that people have. I think that's correct in saying that.
Yeah.
Whereas in the progressive kind of 20th century kind of Fabianized state, the Blairite state of the 2000s, for example, and that all is continuing on now, really, except worse. We have this therapeutic state which wants to basically manipulate the human subject and turn him into the ideal citizen, to do away with all difference, manage inequality, build society, and construct society. Because it's evolutionary, they see their job as
Mm.
remaking, like every cell in your body is constantly replaced and every couple of weeks, basically.
That's right.
It's replaced by a new cell. So people have these theories then, well, that means we're able to turn ourselves into a whole new person, man. But what it really means is not, that's
Yeah.
obviously like, that's when you take it into the kind of like conspiratorial, overly overly new age kind of way, but basically what that means is that you do renew, and and the state sees itself as being able to manipulate that and to take advantage of those long processes and make the citizen they want. So that's why the immigration is such a dangerous thing, because they think they can avoid this biological reality, and that evolution has kind of moved beyond. I've been reading some of these like theorists of like Laszlo, Irvin Laszlo. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but
Yes.
he was
Yeah.
famous. Like, if you're into looking at all that kind of what's going on with the UN and all, and the Club of
Mm.
Rome and all, these are the guys you need to be reading, because Laszlo is like, he's using evolutionary theory to kind of come up with a whole new idea of what politics and society should be like, and it's Platonic universalist kind of thing, and his whole thing is that we can uh become this kind of integrated society with all of the like all of these differences are going to kind of go away pretty much, and like we're beyond basically biological evolution. That was a stage, and now we're into this newer higher level of evolution, so none of the biology matters.
But it's funny you should mention that, because it's not just in the secular domain, but you've got theologians like Teilhard de Chardin,
Mm,
and he spoke of the new sphere, and again, this evolutionary process. And it's all, of course, uh, presumed, or a presuppositional based on this kind of materialist outlook on life. Now, I'm not saying, or understrata or substrata rather. Now, I'm not saying that Teilhard de Chardin was a materialist, but I'm just saying that ultimately there seems to be this kind of uh, merging of kind of this, what shall I say, this evolutionary process with consciousness. And that's fine. But ultimately, I think people can get captured too easily by a lot of the so-called progress that we're seeing today. And it's actually can be quite dangerous. And if I can give an example, and I wrote an essay on this as well, if you look at human rights, I think there's a lot of discussion required around human rights. And that emerged after World War II. And but if you look at human rights, and you mention natural law, and of course in our constitution, all natural law is antecedent and superior to positive law. And positive law, as I said earlier on, is effectively law that doesn't depend on any form of morality.
yeah,
Law is what law is. Law is what is adjudicated. Law is what is legislated for. Okay? So you can bring in the most ridiculous law and it's law, whereas natural lawyers say no, it must be grounded in reason, must have some attendant value to reason. But ultimately, if you look across the world, especially in human rights disciplines, human rights emerged because it was heavily anchored to teleology and natural law. There was it was anchored with inherence, which effectively means that people have rights by virtue of their human status. That alone is enough. But then it evolved into something contingent, right? That you're only human if, and this is where it gets dangerous. And this is why you'll find an awful lot of organizations, agencies like Amnesty International, who still call themselves human rights organizations, but they're not. They're personhood organizations. Because
yeah,
personhood now is the driving force for a lot of progressives. And why? Because you remove someone from human status and you place them into personhood. And you can do that according to kind of a bait and switch, but also conditionally. So you say you've only rights if, and that's where abortion comes in. So you've got people who say, "Oh, you can only be protected if you have sentience or whatever other categories," but that's conditionalizing humanity, which is actually antithetical to human rights, because what it means effectively is whoever is in charge can determine what are the conditions, and we
yeah,
saw that during the COVID. We had that guy, what's his name, Joe O'Shea, on TV, and he was saying, "Oh, that people who aren't vaxxed shouldn't be allowed into shops or whatever." If I'm getting that right,
yeah,
and there were a few politicians who said the same. they are effectively engaged in a process of dehumanization,
Absolutely,
effectively
yeah,
saying that you no longer have fundamental freedoms by virtue of your humanity because or if, right? It was conditional. And the irony is that these people who are talking about kind of ourselves, nationalists, by and large, overwhelmingly tend to be pro-life, right? Because it's nationalism is grounded in natural law. And once you start to remove natural law from the legal process, you're into tyranny because it's no longer about that it's attendant or adjacent to what is right morally, but but power itself. So whoever has power, that's what dictates.
exactly.
So that's the danger.
Yeah, and I mean, you see this a lot too. Going back to the conspiracy thing, like I mean, that is the way I see the law at this point. If you look at the laws around human rights that have been created, I mean, everything that has really gone wrong in the since World War II, really, with the radical diversity, multiculturalism, mass immigration. A lot of this is based around human rights, has driven the whole thing the whole way along, because you know it is proclaimed that certain groups are being discriminated against, and therefore we need to redress this. And so the original version was affirmative action, and affirmative action, we were told, was just going to be in America. They were told, we didn't have it obviously, but in America they did. This is just going to take 20 years or so, and it'll work out. But it never did. It just kept going, and it just kept moving into more and more areas of life, and more aspects of your more of your actual genuine rights, which are based on natural law principles, basically, uh, are basically eroded and gotten rid of, because we're trying to achieve some artificial notion of equality, which
Exactly.
wouldn't even
And it's
exist.
very ideological because there is no equality, because equality means participation for all. But obviously, if you're a white male heterosexual, well, obviously you're excluded. That's the antithesis of inclusivity. That's why, in a way, they use. I mean, it's like George Orwell or whatever, where an expression is made, but it's actually its antithesis. And I, I listen. I think we're entering a very dangerous phase because people no longer critically think anymore. It's whatever is the soundbite of the day wins. And you'll notice actually that a good slogan tends to be far more successful than a deep critical analysis of a subject, because people have been engineered not to read, not to be critical anymore. And again, it's like a kind of it's like a type of consumerism in a
Yeah,
way. We approach now knowledge purely consuming
sound
the more
bites.
sound bites rather than actually trying to edify and increase our knowledge of the world.
Yeah, and
And
this is one of the reasons I find social media so tiring. Like I'm on X, and I've been on it about a year now. Like, what I've got nearly 400 followers. And that has been a long time coming. I remember there was one day I got retweeted by Morgoth because I commented under one of his streams. Like, and that was, I remember that day I couldn't. Oh my god, all these people are, and I was like, how do people do this? How do people like communicate with all of these people? Like, it's actually incredibly tiring.
well, you're 400 times more successful than I am, so
Well,
Don.
that was only the
Well
one
done.
time. you know.
Yeah.
But I've just it was an insight into, like, influencers have a bit, big influencers, have this constant churn of, like, individuals, comments, people arguing with them. That's why I don't get angry with people when they don't comment or they don't respond to me. You know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
whatever. You know what I mean? I'll probably forget about it tomorrow anyway. But, like, I actually don't think it's very healthy for your thought process, because the modern, like, kind of influencer, like, archetype, like, they're basically, you're in this constant state of reaction. And if you
Mm.
actually want to step away and develop your ideas, what happens is you will lose some of your audience, and more of them will kind of lose touch with you over time. And so you're trying to sharpen the axe, so to speak, and develop your ideas, and you've got questions, and you want to make sure what you're saying is actually valuable and true. But the inherent reward of social media is in kind of posting regularly, and obviously posting interesting content that people want to see. But
Mm.
if you are not kind of hammering it every day, you basically fall out of the cycle. You fall out of people's conscience, like, and people think you're not there, so you actually don't exist. And it makes me question, like, are a lot of these influencers actually developing their ideas, or are they just kind of are they just marketing a set of slogans and ideas that they've kind of came to originally, and they're not really developing beyond that, you know? Because
Well, it's kind of
I
like
hate the
music,
idea of
popular
just doing
music.
that.
It's like Stock Aitken and Waterman. Have you ever heard of? They were
Yeah,
kind of
producers.
notorious,
Yeah,
and they'd put out garbage, kind of real, kind of garbage music that sold. Okay, because it had a certain melody, whatever, and they had a formula that worked. But ultimately, like what we're seeing is kind of iterations of the same garbage over and over again. And I think we're kind of people get kind of stuck in this kind of informational loop without actually digesting what's in front of them. And I've said this to a couple of my friends that the one thing society is missing is actually the ability to be bored. Because if you look throughout society, some of the greatest inventions, some of the greatest thinkers, it was during moments of boredom that they got inspiration. And what does a phone do? It constantly keeps us occupied with absolute garbage.
yeah.
And I think I don't know. I even
Don't
going back,
get on X. That's all I've got to say. If you're worried about being fed garbage, my God, you know.
but even what you were saying earlier on is so true, Don. Because I've been looking at have you ever come across a theorist called Pierre Bourdieu?
I think
No,
I have heard of him. Yeah.
yeah,
Did you mention him
symbolic
before? I can't
capital.
remember. Yeah, symbolic. I've heard of that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and he made like I've latched onto this because it makes a whole lot of sense, right? Because today, like people go on about Micheál Martin Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, that they'll put them into a political, you know, frame, whether kind of centre right or left or whatever. But ultimately, they're fairly neutral insofar as they're chameleons, really.
Yeah, exactly. They have no actual values. That's the great thing
Exactly, they've
with
no
these
principles at
people.
all, right? If the wind blew one direction and it blew the next direction and it gave them power, they'd completely harness that. And that's what makes them very dangerous, right? And the thing is, like, the reason these people do it obviously is for power, but it's also the recognition that in society, emergent from kind of mass consumerism and mass individualization, is this sense of reputational currency. Today, it's all about reputation. It's all about, and that's why this therapeutic culture is very important because it creates this necessity for reputational building. That's why celebrities, influencers, that's why you even have oikophobia, which is completely unnatural. How can you honestly understand? For example, I think there was a woman in Sweden and she was violated by a foreigner, and she ended up apologizing to the violator. Okay, now that's some form of altruism or pathological altruism right there. But if you dig a bit deeper, really, what it's really doing is she was trading on reputation because reputation now is the highest currency. That's why we know this because it's not about convictions. Because as I said earlier on, to hold a conviction, there must be a personal cost. That's why all these journalists in RT who are earning a fortune, they're not going to be uh, discommoded by mass immigration. Of course not.
Yeah.
But they hold the right opinions because in their culture or in their little mini communities, holding those type of opinions gives them status.
Yeah, and I tell you, that's actually exactly kind of leading into how I kind of view a lot of the causes. You know, we were saying, like, there's people look for a direct group who's responsible, and they'll say, well, particular ethnic groups or
Mm,
particular, an institution. Back in the 40s, this institution was created, and this did this. And listen, I always say, I'm interested in this. I've spent, like, probably 15 years at this point reading about, like, Chatham House and all these institutions that undeniably are important in global affairs. But,
mm.
like, there is this kind of this often kind of speaks beyond our own kind of complicity or our own immersion in a paradigm. And so a lot of like a lot of what I think is driving this is that since the emergence of like the modern period, which is kind of 17th century, 18th century onwards. Before that is kind of considered pre-modern, I think. But like basically from the scientific revolution onwards, you have, and from the beginning of like secular government kind of divorced from Rome in Europe, really. So you have the Reformation and everything, and then you have the like Henry VIII breaks off in England,
Mm,
and then you begin this like I am sovereign in this territory. This
mm,
is like we do what we want here. I'm in charge of the religion. I'm in charge of the law, and this is my kingdom. And what they began doing was they began establishing a secular ruling class, basically. So they began to move away from like the church as the kind of legislator or guide, and they began to. This is the first time that Europe began to get secular leaders, and so you began getting this new class emerges of administrators and kind of managers, proto managers in
mm,
the, a bit like what the earliest version of what we have now, basically in something like the ESRI and the civil service and all this, and and the whole class is built on that, and it goes through changes. But you see that in Germany in the 19th century when the state is centralized under Bismarck, there's a new class emerge, and a lot of theories have been written about how that class became eventually, to actually go to support Hitler because they were kind of in a structure and they held power and
mm,
they had this kind of cohesiveness and everything. But regardless, like these there is a class thing here to see. But when you're describing this kind of progressive middle class type of person, like they're kind of that whole process has now been democratized, where a much larger section of society is kind of involved in that kind of work, civil
mm,
service, like administration, managerial stuff, quangos, and civil society institutions are another part of that. They're all part of that kind of class. Like I often call like civil society NGOs to do with like LGBT and anti-racism and immigration and all this. They're basically a welfare program for the middle class.
exactly. Yeah.
Like it's a polite way of saying we don't have a job for you, but we have a job for you. Like, and you know the values that they hold. Like this is part of of an actual class thing, and obviously people will assume I'm making like a Marxist point by saying that. I can assure you, I'm not. It's not at all. Like class is real regardless of whether Marx or any of these theorists have ideas about it. It does exist. Certain kind of professions have certain characteristics and people are drawn to them because they have certain characteristics. And a lot of the issues that we have, I think, in the current time are driven from that. Our society now is attempting to keep employment for all of this kind of overproduced elite. Basically, some people have called it the overproduction of elites. There's way too many administrators,
Mm,
there's way too much mess, too much bloat, and they're involved in every aspect of our lives. They're going into the schools right now. People are very excised, rightfully, about that in terms of what they're doing. But it shows you that like these people's values can be manipulated and formed so easily. Like a couple of years ago, they probably would have been going mad about the idea of transgender propaganda in
mm,
schools. There's no
mm,
way, no one would even think of doing such a thing.
mm.
But now, like a substantial portion of this class will say, "Oh, absolutely, that's fine."
But there's
Yeah,
also two aspects to that. You mentioned there about kind of the managerial class and their values. Like, I've often asked this question: how many of the CEOs of the big charities would still engage in that charity if they did it for free? I would argue very few.
yeah, they'd
Because
get a
ultimately it's
career
about
somewhere else.
status and money. And
Yeah,
like it's one of the reasons given, oh, why are CEOs and charities given so much money and said, oh, market forces. But sure, the whole aspect of the whole thing about charity is that it's not kind of overly managerial, it's not bureaucratic, it's not secular. It's about, I mean, charity comes from the Latin word caritas, kindness.
yeah.
So it's completely divorced from its root because it's just
Mm.
an industry, and as you said, it's a form of unaccountable uh, 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 political lobbying,
Yeah,
effectively.
and if you look at actually to prove that point, right? To actually prove that, you can look at the like. There's obviously there's a much earlier version of NGOs, and you might call them missionaries. It's for not doesn't map perfectly, but they carried out a social function as well. And so they had charity and they had a social function, and so that's been going for hundreds of years. But in the 19th century, the Rockefeller family, just to get into a really conspiratorial kind of narrative here, the Rockefeller family, the famous family, they actually did support a lot of missionaries in places like China and down in the south, in the southern states in America. And there was this big like division between evangelical and more mainline kind of Protestant Anglican kind of church. But basically, they were using these institutions to basically pave the way for markets, American influence. And in the 60s, you get this occur as well, because that was like a new wave happened after the war and everything. You had the UN create, well, close to the UN. You had the what's it called, the migrants organization, the
IOM, is it?
IOM, yeah, the IOM. That was basically that came out of all that. And you have this Biafra in Ireland, and all these Africa concern, and a lot of people, get involved in these things, for really, really good reasons,
Mm.
decent people. But if you look at what those, and Amnesty International came along after that, and if you look at what those institutions are doing now, well, a lot of them were part of the coalition, which is promoting abortion, gay marriage. And so you have this whole institutional layer acting in a kind of a conspiracy, basically, to achieve certain things. They're all promoting sustainable development. They're all promoting anti-racism. And a lot of them are really radical. Even the religious ones, they're really radical.
Yeah, they're
And,
cultural imperialists,
and
effectively, because
they are, yeah.
ironically, they'll talk about old empires, but they're the new empire. It's a more sophisticated empire. And in
Yeah.
fact, it's a more egregious and more um, invisible empire because they condition funding based upon acceptance of certain values originating from these kind of quangos and NGOs.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not appreciated. It's not appreciated like that there is a propaganda, there is a whole social engineering kind of aspect to these institutions. Like someone, like, to use the cliche, like George Soros, or I could list dozens of others,
Mm,
you know, they're not simply operating even on their own in some respects. You could look at a lot of these NGOs, like they're operating in different conflict zones. Like a lot of them were accused during Biafra, they were being accused by the Nigerian government of funding weapons, for
mm,
example.
yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot of a multitude of sins can be covered up with the claim of philanthropy. And going back to the regime change analysis we did earlier on, like our analogy, that was another perfect example there of, I operate a charity and it's in Ukraine right now, or the White Helmets in Syria. The White Helmets are doing good and we're trying to do it. And then you see footage of them cutting the head off of a child,
Yeah.
this kind of thing. Like, and, people get caught up in assuming that because something is official or sanctioned, that it's automatically good. This must have the correct values. And there's a certain class of people who you could probably narrow down. I think a lot of middle class people can be like this. They can be very much, their values are kind of transactional. And like you're saying, they're very much based on social capital concerns. Because if they lose that social capital, well, they're kind of nobody. They're moving back down the kind of the class system, which now is kind of values based. You gain social capital by having the correct progressive opinion.
Exactly, and like we spoke or at the start about conspiracies, and when you're talking about NGOs, that is conspiratorial. Like I went to Africa years ago with the VSO. We had to do training, and it wasn't about just implementing your skill set, but there was an underlying philosophy and ideology you were meant to implement as well. And that is structural, that is intentional. And of course, it's by nature conspiratorial because people conceive of this and they say it must be implemented with a view to influencing people down the line who may not even be aware of any conspiracy or any previous agreement. And we see this all the time, and it's very, very subtle. And people go on, like you have the left today, right, and say, oh, the church influenced the population. But when you look at it in context, which seems to be often forgotten, Ireland upon independence, what does a nation tend to do when it gains independence? It tries to define itself exactly in opposition to its colonizer. The
Yeah.
colonizer in Ireland, what was the church? The Church of Ireland, the established church. So of course and we had the penal law. So of course there's going to be a Catholicity, shall I say, uh, within the values of the state. But not only that, but we must remember 95% of the population were Catholic. So of course culture, there, what is culture but values, attitudes and beliefs. So of course they're going to inform policy. And policy then is institutionalized via legislation. But here's the kicker. But sure, we see the same. In fact, there's a more insidious influence now through NGOs that are not accountable. And in
Yeah, and
fact,
I'll tell you,
they're
yeah,
doing they have far more influence than, and because this is another myth is about De Valera. De Valera was excommunicated during the
mm,
War of Independence. Now, what does that say? That says that De Valera was willing to put his political motives ahead of his spiritual motives, right? So it frames De Valera in a very different way, and I'm not a huge fan of De Valera. I'm not, but like it frames him in such a way that like he wasn't so beholding as if he was some kind of obsequious kind of slave to the church. That's nonsense.
yeah. But progressives are very effective at creating these simplistic kind of fact memes,
Hmm.
where they'll take some aspect of a character like De Valera and they'll simplify it, where all you see is this kind of old man on a postage stamp,
That's
and
right.
he is just Catholic Ireland, and that's old, and that's gone. And anyone that was, anyone that thinks there was anything good came out of that at any point, or that people were just so miserable, and I'm thinking of all my grandparents who lived through that period, who I knew, like, and they didn't seem very unhappy, like, they thought
Exactly.
current
Yeah.
times were far worse in
And
terms of
let's
culture and everything.
and I think a lot of if there was misery, which I'm sure there was in any society, a lot of it was due to economics. I
Exactly.
mean, people like I grew up in the 70s and 80s, didn't have a whole lot, but we did have family. We certainly had a sense of community. When I was in school, we were proud to be Irish and we knew what Irish was. And even more importantly, we knew what wasn't Irish. And even if you look back at kind of the first World Cup that we were in 1990, I remember in Cork, people were going berserk. There was a genuine pride in what was Irish and a real genuine understanding of what it was to be Irish. And like you've got people today, I can't understand how some people can say that Ireland is for the world, right? But then in the same sentence, they'll say Palestine is for Palestinians. And I think a lot of nationalists fall into this kind of false dichotomy of either Palestine or Israel. Now, if you're a nationalist, you won't be promoting Israel for a start. But I adopt the old kind of neither king nor Kaiser attitude because, yeah, I have sympathy with any children, any people who are being slaughtered, right? You'd have to have. But ultimately, and I say this, and it's very inconvenient, but also fairly unpopular. I've seen Palestinian politicians, right, go attend Sinn Féin ordeshes, where Sinn Féin have engaged in unbelievable anti-Irish, anti-Catholic rhetoric. I've not seen one Palestinian politician say, "Hang on here,
Yeah.
you're supporting us, but I want no part if you're destroying your own country."
Yeah.
None of them will. I've never seen a Palestinian say, hang on to Sinn Féin, because ultimately Palestinians are, in fairness, self-interested. And they'll say, listen, we'll take support wherever it is. Danny Morrison famously put out a tweet a couple of years ago, Palestine is far more important than Ireland.
Yeah.
This,
That
this
really, I
is
remember
where
that.
these
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, this is where, and you have some Americans who still think that Sinn Féin are pro-Irish. They're not Irish. In
Yeah.
fact, I have a theory actually, and I don't want to spend
I'll
too
give
much
you one
time.
as well, actually, when you're done. Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a theory, right? That, and we've heard it actually. Israeli commentators have spoken about it. They said, "Well, you can't defeat Hamas, right? Because it's an idea, right? So how? What do? You you disrupt the idea. You make the idea itself uh, unpalatable. Guess what Sinn Féin are doing? Because if you destroy Irishness, well, that's game over. Doesn't matter what iteration follows, because in order to defend something, you have to have the something. But if you get rid of the something, well, then you've complete domination, dominion. And Sinn Féin are one of the biggest promoters of anything that is anti-Irish, and they're in lockstep with the Democratic Party in America. They're in
Exactly.
lockstep with EU globalists. Now, they'll say they're not, but we all know they are. Declan Carney in 2019, was it February or April, in An Public, openly said, we want a multicultural Ireland. And they only changed their tack because of political expediency.
Yeah,
These
they're very
people,
cynical.
right? Yeah, these people are the most anti-Irish. And the sad thing is, because of the branding, you know, that Sinn Féin has historically in this country, there will be people, no matter what, who will support these people, and they are traitors to the country. Like they
Yeah,
have been for a
particularly for
while
them,
now.
like who
Yeah,
were very, militant about what they wanted to achieve. It was a very clear kind of mission, to be then turning around like and kind of enforcing basically what amounts to British progressive ideologies,
that's right.
and American, British and American ideologies because they kind of immerse together. But that's the like I my whole kind of theory with from an ideological idea of what happened was that because of the period that they kind of got established in, it was the late 60s, early 70s. You had decolonization at its height, and and they, of course, they made relationships with a lot of people, like in Gaddafi most famously, but also the PLO and everything. And they got caught up in this because a lot of these ideology, in order, a lot of these ideologies are basically intellectual movements as well. So at that time, you had decolonization, post-colonial theory, and if you look at there's actually I tell you who has a great theory of this, and people will balk, but Zbigniew Brzezinski. I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yeah,
Like he's one of the grand strategists of the American kind of
that's right.
20th century, and he has the most famous book of his is Between Two Ages. Is the first one he did basically after he had met Rockefeller and all, and he was at Columbia, and he in that book is actually fascinating because of his social analysis, because he talks about how do we address the divergence basically between America and these developing countries as they were called. And he was basically saying that the danger is that, and I actually found myself agreeing with Brzezinski. Maybe it's because I'm an arch right winger, maybe spiritually, but I kind of found myself kind of going, he has a point here. He said, what the danger we have is that in these countries, there is a kind of bourgeois, kind of middle class
Mm,
who are really keen to get wealth and power and political power. And they are immersed in basically, he calls them a pseudo intelligentsia.
mm,
And what he means by that is that they're not really an intelligentsia. They're kind of a second rate one
mm,
because they don't have the patience or the kind of humility to kind of say it's going to take a while for
mm,
these countries to develop and all the rest of it. And they will pick up these trendy ideas coming out of America and coming out of basically these Western neo-Marxist theories like Marcuse. And there was a lot of people were very hyped about Mao at that time in the 70s, a lot of the students and all. And so this was the time of all this, remember the generation of 68 and all in Paris and all.
that's right.
Like there's a lot of Marxist trappings, but in reality I don't think it's really Marxism at all. Like I think it's actually something much more. Marxism is kind of sublimated in there, if that's the right way of saying it. Like but it's not actually the thing. What it actually represents is this kind of feckless kind of like group of young people who don't really have any wisdom and who are latching on to any kind of revolutionary type of thing.
That's right.
And a lot of that ideology penetrated into the Republican movement, I believe. And I think Jerry Adams was in particular was very much caught up in that. And if you think about it, Jerry Adams, they didn't have like a really intensive education or anything. A lot of these guys had to leave school very early and everything. And so they pick up what was the trendy kind of ideologies at the time that spoke to them.
Yes.
So you'll see Jerry Adams is referenced, for example. I've got books in England coming out in the 70s and 80s, and they're referencing Jerry Adams as this kind of anti-imperialist, anti-racist kind of character
Mm.
who's fighting, not it's not about Irish independence. It's actually got to do with human rights and this overall kind of a search for ending inequality and racism and bigotry and all the rest of it. So in a way, the human rights framing of the kind of how it started in '68 and all, in '69 and all up in the north, like a lot of that has been kind of sublimated into this huge belief package, and into that then poured all this other stuff. Like so, it's like the center for a lot of these people is actually Islington, you know,
Yes.
and a lot of the trendy at the time neo-Marxian kind of interpretations of Marxism, which kind of made sense in the '70s. It was easy to say that, like, well, we're oppressed because of, but it totally diverted the impulse from what should be a simple message of this is a national, it's about sovereignty. It's about getting the six counties back. It's a very simple political message, actually, like to communicate.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
it all got sidetracked.
I see Sinn Féin really as promoting a negative identity. And by negative, I mean they identify themselves not as something that they are, but something that their opposition are not.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, like, you've got, the unionists up north tend to be kind of fairly evangelical in their, when it comes to social value. Therefore, Sinn Féin will say, well, we're going to be progressive. They're going, they'll be the evangelical Protestants or whatever, the unionists will be insular, the Sinn Féiners will be globalist. Uh, there's an allegiance with evangelicalism and Israel. Sinn Féin, of course, then will take on side the Palestinian movement. Now, I'm not saying it's kind of necessarily a pure mirror, but there is an alignment there. And I think it ultimately reveals an immense insecurity. Because until you start to frame yourself positively, as in kind of saying, this is who we are, regardless of what
Exactly.
someone else is. And the thing is, like, I would say, let's be honest, there was probably an awful lot of infiltration. And one thing you and I have discussed with a mutual friend is about um, infiltration, the Dirty Tricks campaign in Northern Ireland. Uh, you, we know with Mossad and stuff, with Jeffrey Epstein. I would say there's a subculture out there that I think if most normies were aware of, they'd be actually disgusted. So disgusted, I think they'd be catatonic. And like, there's a guy called Wilson, and I can't remember his first name, but the documentary is still on YouTube. And he was kind of he worked for British intelligence. He was uh, in the uh, Ulster Defence Regiment, I think, and he worked, as I said, in the intelligence wing up in Northern Ireland. But I think he became kind of a whistleblower because he understood that at the time that MI5 or MI6, whoever, were not only looking at Republicans, but were also monitoring or surveying um, uh, Labour and the left in
Of
England.
course. Yeah.
And this guy Wilson found it very disturbing. Anyway, Wilson effectively they were able to kind of frame him effectively for a murder and completely discredit him. And when I came across that, I said, "Wow! I mean, we don't know half of what's going on. I mean, there's stuff there that's going on behind closed doors with by people. I would argue probably very high in the dark tetrad: psychopathy, sadism, Machiavellism, manipulation, whatever. And these characters are out there, and they are driven not necessarily by ideology, but probably by reputation too. And a lot of us who probably are quite naive in many respects, who love our country, we really don't know either what we're up against. I mean, the level of corruption, even in the Gardaí, I would say, is fairly significant.
Yeah.
We know the corruption in the political class. We also know the corruption, the moral corruption in the media class. And Well, I like in order to diagnose something and to offer a solution, I think you have to diagnose it accurately and honestly. And this is one thing I need to say, Don, and it's inconvenient for a lot of people, and I don't actually like saying it, but people go on about politicians, as I've done, and the media and whatever. But ultimately, Irish people have played a huge role in the treachery of their own country.
This is
They,
I'm glad you brought this up because this is actually when I contacted you there yesterday to set this up. That was the last thing I finished off with was saying like, oh, there's it's not just elites. Like that's my kind of perspective is that it actually comes down to the basically the nature of the people,
that's
the
right.
nature of the Irish. Like I'll say this straight out. I've no problem saying it. I've no intention of going standing for election or
Mm.
humoring people. A lot of Irish people are not good people.
They are
They're
exactly,
selfish. They're
exactly,
selfish.
exactly.
And it's a very selfish culture now.
Very
And I
selfish.
don't like saying that either. It's like
No,
I
but
feel
it's
like I'm
true
having
though.
a go at people, but the truth is like people will choose to fuck over their own people
That's right.
in
And in
oftentimes,
fact, I started talking tonight about Father James O'Hegarty, who was um, during the penal laws, who was executed by the British. And it wasn't a British spy who dobbed him in; it was his own brother-in-law.
Yeah.
If you look up throughout Irish history, even art, for example, this is what I find fascinating. There are many historians who argue that Arthur Guinness was a spy for the British against the United Irishmen. Right?
Mm,
We know for a fact that during the War of Independence, that the Guinness Brewery gave lorries that were converted into armored cars for the British. Right? We also know that there was rampant discrimination in Guinness Brewery against Catholics in the so-called theocracy of the Irish Republic, right? Even
yeah.
into the 30s, right? In the centre of Dublin. Now, why is it that every kind of dignitary that comes to Ireland has to be photographed with a pint of Guinness
At
that
Dublin, yeah.
effectively was founded by a guy who many say was an informer who operated discrimination against the vast majority of Dubliners? Like,
Yeah, when you think about the act, when I talk about the psyop, I mean, think about the psyop of like Guinness beer being the one thing that
that's
people
right.
think of Ireland when they go
Yeah,
abroad.
it's remarkable when you start to look into this stuff. And it's not this kind of, oh, they were lizard people. This is genuinely, this is not even controvertible. Well, maybe the fact that it's not completely 100% certain that he was an informer, but there are people who, historians who make the claim. But like, I just find it remarkable that I don't know. It's just like, for example, another thing that I always got confused, right, is that people go on about this Catholic theocracy, yet historically, one of the biggest enemies of the Catholic Church was the Freemasons, historically. Yet there was a Freemason, one of the biggest and the second oldest Freemasons lodge within, is it 400 meters of
Oh yeah,
Leinster
them
House?
this shows. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I'm sure even the who's the Duke of Leinster. You know what I mean? I mean the there's all of this. Like I really do think it's a campaign. Like I think this kind of the bad old days misery kind of porn about the old
Like
Ireland.
Angela's Ashes, yeah,
Angela's Ashes, the Angela's Ashesification of Irish history. And they keep moving. John Ward was saying this, like they keep moving forward in the decades. You know, it used to be when he was young. He said it used to be the 50s. When he was in the 70s and all, they were demonizing the 50s, and
that's
then it
right.
moved up to the 80s. They were up to the 80s there up a
Right.
couple of years ago, and now they're going back, going forward even more, like because they have to come up with a foundation myth every couple of years for the new generation about how don't you dare go back to before Maastricht. Don't you dare, don't you dare question this, and there's this, like, I actually think we're living in a far more stifling intellectual culture.
Oh, unbelievable.
If you look at the caliber of public discourse, um, even in just take the media, like, is there any real talk show in
No,
Ireland?
No,
Talk radio was the thing that like that was kind of what launched the conservative kind of Reagan thing, well, no, it was the opposition to Clinton, wasn't it, in the
that's right.
'90s with Limbaugh. And I'm not saying I'm a huge fan of that or anything either, but like, at least there was this kind of outlet, at that time where you could hear some guy that at least differed from some of these mainstream progressives. In Ireland, there's basically nothing. I mean, Newstalk FM is basically created by a bunch of progressives. It's cultivated. It doesn't allow on open phone lines, and you basically just listen to someone repeat the news every hour, interspersed with like Sean Moncrief or even honestly, I don't know, some of these people. And it used to be George Hook was on it, and he actually would put like a position that was contrary to some of the
Consent.
consensus.
Yeah,
And he's a good broadcaster, and he was ran off of it.
that's right.
And to me, like when that was like a major red flag, because that was the only thing I could listen to on the radio at that point.
Mm.
You know, when I'd be working, I'd have him on in the afternoon. And when that went off, I was like, I'm done with this. I used to suffer through it to hear him kind of talk about just in general about different. He'd have interesting guests that the rest of them wouldn't have, and then I just said that was 2018 or whenever it was. He got kicked off. I said, I'm done. I'm done with this now. Like this is ridiculous. And there's nothing. I mean, it's like they get worse every year. Every year,
But to
it's like they get
satisfy
worse.
the accusation of bias, you see, Don, they'll put on the worst representative of a cause, the most, uh, inarticulate, and we're not having a pop of anybody who went on, right? But they purposely do that because they then can say to, their audience, "Oh, listen, we play fair," but it's all stacked. It's like I mentioned at the outset of Stephen Luke's, and I mentioned like that there are three faces of power according to his theory. And the first phase was decision making power, and it's the most obvious form. It happens when just say two people or groups want different things and if an open disagreement and one side wins. That's the first phase. The second is called the gatekeeper phase. This is the agenda setting power. This is far more subtle, and we've kind of discussed it already. And this phase isn't about winning the argument; it's about preventing the argument from ever happening in the first place. So you can control what people are allowed to talk about, and you make sure your interests are never challenged, right? And that's what happens when you bring on people who kind of maybe not very articulate or easy to manipulate. But the third phase, this is the most insidious phase, right? And it's the mind control phase of ideological power. And this is kind of the most radical. And it occurs where those in power influence what people actually want themselves, even if it's against their own interests. So, like, a good example is like a company, just say, convinces its workers that, let me see, working 60 hours a week, say, for no extra pay is a prestigious kind of badge of honor. So the workers don't complain and they actually then want to do it. And the
Mhm.
company has shaped their desires, but it's against their own interests. And that's what we're seeing today. We're seeing kind of mass immigration where it's being presented as if you want your own nation to survive, well, then you're evil incarnate. And it's
Yeah,
very, very manipulative. And if we had an honest to God um, journalistic class, which we don't, there would be genuine conversation. But the very fact that they're muting it suggests that there's almost a fait accompli that this is going ahead. And we spoke about conspiracies and we kind of sidetracked a small bit, but like ultimately, there are decisions being made that we have, and we're given this kind of, shall I say, appearance of participation. For example, look at the Lisbon Treaty. When the Irish rejected that, it was effectively based on three conditions, if I can remember. One was that we retain autonomy over the abortion issue. Second, neutrality. And the third, I think, was to do with um, the corporation tax, if I can remember. And the fourth, there was a kind of fourth, and I think it related to same sex marriage, right? Well, same sex marriage has already been overturned. Abortion has been overturned. We're now seeing neutrality, right, on the cusp of being overturned, right? And of course, the corporate thing, well, That's up for grabs after the Apple case. And the thing is, people still think that we're living in a democracy. Ultimately, we have the pretense of participation, where people are bombarded with propaganda to give back, it's a fait accompli, what has been decided already. And that's like, look at these kind of citizen assemblies. Like, who decides what's on the agenda there? But obviously, I mean,
Yeah.
you'll never get a citizens' assembly. Let's have a citizens' assembly about immigration, because they don't even want the prospect of people actually saying we need to vote on this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's it, like that is the nature of liberalism. Like I was saying, it's like these kinds of managed processes. It's all process. You're tied up in process, and
Yeah.
you can't point to the exact thing, which is the problem. Like, but which actually is that the power is not visible, because every citizen, like we could do a whole stream on that alone, talking about how that got started. A couple of these specific academics, who have influence, they're able to manufacture this kind of, and then you get a bit of media training, you get a bit of collaboration, stories are put in the media, and people, because of the time, because it's the aftermath of the great financial crash, basically, people are open to change. So one of the themes that I have going on in these streams I've been doing for the last few months, like, is that a great, and other people have picked up on this, of course, but a lot of a lot of what we're dealing with in the current years, like, is that it came out of that period when people were discombobulated and
Mm.
desperate for change, and it was almost like the government was able, or the establishment, rather, not the government, the establishment
Yeah.
was able to basically use like a judo move to
Mm.
take, because I believe you can basically take uh anger, frustration, all of these things that the people have, like the masses have no mind. The mass is just unthinking, and the mass is controlled by their feelings. And if you can take those feelings of unhappiness, dissatisfaction, and you can basically direct it somewhere else, you can do what you want with it. It doesn't matter if that thing is counter to the, like, explanation that they would give for why they're unhappy. Like, I remember that time they were able to basically take the unhappiness with the crash, and they were able to turn it into this massive social change project, in
That's
which
right.
you'd almost think that Ireland had been like a theocracy beforehand. Like,
That's right.
they were blaming, like, oh, all our institutions need to be changed. No, what they were doing was they were basically taking the opportunity to do what the progressives wanted to do for decades beforehand, which
Well,
is
Tony Blair
get
did
all this
that.
stuff out of, yeah, exactly, the Blairification of the whole
Yeah,
country. Yeah.
exactly. And I suppose as well, like, I came across something a couple of years ago, and I always found it quite frightening in itself. Some people might say, "What is he on about?" Which is fair enough. But Niall Ferguson, the historian, said something that I found really interesting a couple of years ago. And he said about social transformation. And he said, one of the biggest elements of social transformation around, and it coincided with the Reformation, is the invention of the printing press, right? And of course, that meant that ideas were disseminated further afield and at a far rapid pace. Well, he said one of the most uh, groundbreaking or kind of uh, forms of dissemination was the internet. And of course, there's the belief, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but there's the belief that the internet was a project from military intelligence, right?
Just DARPA,
Again,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
so Ferguson would argue, which I agree, he said, societies are being transformed now 10 times faster. An event, for example, gay marriage, that might have taken, the origins might have kicked off over time. It was subtly, accretively, like, you know, a, um, a cliff edge being, corroded or eroded rather over time by the waves, right? It would chip away and eventually you'd reach a certain point in history. But what's happening now because of the internet, there's social transformation is happening 10 times faster. So what might have taken 100 years is now taking 10 years. For example, when I was growing up, there was a movie called, what's it called? Something, Chuck and something got married, whatever. It was a
Oh, Bill.
pasty.
Oh, yeah, Bill and Chuck or something. I can't remember. I know what
Yeah.
you're on about. I think, yeah.
And they got married, right? And the premise was that it was two men getting married, right? And
Two Men
everybody,
and a Baby was another one, wasn't it? Was it
yeah,
like that?
they
You know?
thought it was hilarious. But now, if you even say to anybody saying, "Oh, their two men got married," don't you find that odd? They'll go, "How dare you?" Right?
Yeah.
And it just shows you how transformative modern society is because of technology. And it's going to get worse. Like, for example, you've got all the deep fakes. Even if something were exposed tomorrow, right? Something real. Well, they now have plausible deniability. They can say, oh, that's a deep fake.
Yeah.
So we were on about earlier on about societal confusion, and there's a, a belief of what is it, hybrid warfare and full spectrum dominance. So you've dominance over all aspects of society, where it's effectively it's no longer even a kinetic war; it's a psychological war, where people. I liken it in a way, and I'll finish on this. If you're in an airplane, imagine, and you were over, kind of the you're over the sea just beyond Florida, and you're suddenly, in a there's clouds all around you, and you suddenly go unconscious for 5 seconds, right? And obviously, with asides gravity, you'll know if you're up or down. But just say, and all your instruments aren't working because of some technical fault, right? So you don't know if you're going left, right, or whatever. That's how I feel the confusion is being formed, because people no longer know. There's no foundational point where people can say, okay, here's the point where I can start off, and I know this is stable ground.
I remember when the flat Earth thing kicked off back in. Well, for me, I just noticed it back in 20. I think it was 28, 17 or 18, and like to me, like that was a major sign, like that there's something really wrong, like with people, like that they are like too online, too disconnected, too compartmentalized, and not touching grass, so to speak. They're just not. Some of these people are just falling into these little, like, weird little subcultures.
Mm.
And I often wondered, was that deliberate to put that particular one as well? It's so perfectly cartoonish, that there's so much that goes into that. Like, you have to deny so much to get to that point. Like radar and satellites and all this technology and gravity, even and the moon. The moon doesn't make sense. All this stuff. Like, how is my friend in Australia in darkness then? And that, how do you put your hand on the truth if you
Yeah.
start off from that, like, and you make, and I actually met one in real life. And this is incredible, like, but, like,
Yeah.
yeah, well, I didn't meet him, my friend knew him, like,
Yeah.
and he was telling me about this, like, and I said, like, this is a extraordinary. I couldn't stop laughing. It was just so,
But we're living in an age of absurdities, Don. I mean, you've
yeah,
got, like, was it the downfall of Nicola Sturgeon was the result really of putting, was it a male rapist into a female prison? I
yeah,
mean, we're and what's comical really is the lengths that people will go to try and legitimize that kind of buffoonery. It's the same. It's the same with, even like you spoke earlier on about Jerry Adams and human rights, but sure, they're one of the biggest promoters of abortion in the country.
yeah,
It's the antithesis of human rights, because
yeah,
it conditions a human being upon wantedness. If you're a baby and you're wanted, well, then you get full protection.
yeah,
If you're a baby and you're unwanted, well, hey, we were only 2 votes away from killing them right up to the point of
yeah,
being delivered.
and then the elderly are next.
That's right, yeah. In Canada, apparently, ex-servicemen are told, right, that listen, you have the opportunity of being euthanized instead of being given care, despite the fact that they fought for their country and probably suffered post-traumatic stress disorder for their country. But in order to bypass kind of any form of genuine care, they're given the opportunity of killing themselves. That's where we are now.
yeah, yeah.
Madness.
It's like, this is almost like the kind of, the end
Bizarro
point,
world,
really.
yeah.
Like, if you're going to start killing, like, um babies, and we've literally done it, like, what's it, 10,000 a year.
That's right. There were
And
72 million abortions last year worldwide, right?
mm,
278,000 alone in Britain last year. And yet, you'll have people, right, like the Irish government who are and the Irish media who are saying only recently that, oh, our birth rate are falling. And you're going, whoa, you're creating all the conditions why our birth rate is falling. Abortion, promiscuity, which affects fecundity, homosexuality, obviously, it's innately infertile, right? And then you suddenly say, "Oh, we have a population problem," but they're creating the very conditions, right, for that decline. And
Exactly, and
this is where they
there's an
come in then
imperative.
and say, "Oh, we better bring in immigrants," and you mentioned earlier on about kind of, short-term plans by the government. Immigration only massages economic figures in
Yeah,
the short term because these guys aren't, for a start, they're not interested in anybody's welfare, let alone fucking foreigners, right? This is another part of the charade because Micheál Martin has a holiday home down in West Cork. If he really cared, where's the humanity, as he said one day on radio?
humanity. Oh, for the
Yeah,
humanity. How dare
He-
you?
he'd lead by example and go, well, I'm leading by example. There's my home. He won't because he has no intention. You can give a toss.
Yeah.
It's all performance and it's all about plastering over. And listen, we could talk forever.
Yeah, no, that's a really good. I was going to. I was also going to say with liberalism, there's this sterility. Like that's a lot of the problem is that this is an economics based kind of system
Mm,
about capital and about human capital is humanity. We're just human capital,
that's right. That's all.
and so we're just moved around and adjusted and monitored. And well, this guy's not productive. I mean, how can you escape then that like we are basically deciding we're going to prolong careers and we're going to pursue hedonism and personal aggrandizement. And then in the next breath, well, we're going to have to bring in people from patriarchal, backward so called cultures to basically breed for us. And the liberal kind of mind is so narrow and so like incapable of seeing these kinds of obvious things. It's just incredible to me like that, a feminist or whatever. Well, that's why I don't have any time for the turfs and all, because
No, exactly. I
you know
mean,
they're pushing basically a sterile culture, which is already after contributing to the destruction of our society. So, you know, don't tell me you want to go back to the version from 10 years ago, please.
but it's even, and I said we'd finish, but I have to say this as well. Like, you've got people there like Graham Lenihan, and listen, fair play to him in some regard, but there was a famous Swiss essayist during the French Revolution. His name was Jacques Mallet Dupin. And he
Mm,
said, revolutions devour their own children because of the myth of Saturn in
yeah,
Roman mythology. And what happens is that Graham Lenihan, to be honest, like he was all on board with progressive ideas only until the revolution, which he participated in, came to bite him and eat him.
yeah, and he was actually quite aggressive. Now, in
Oh,
fairness, he
very aggressive.
apologized to a number of people actually,
Yeah,
so I give him a lot of credit for that. Because
yeah.
a lot of people don't like, but and he did suffer. I mean, he actually really
He
like that
did.
poor bastard. I
Yeah,
mean, he got
you
a
see, a lot of the left don't realise that. They think that they're immune. If you look at the purges during the French Revolution, if you look at the purges during the Bolshevik Revolution, who were the biggest threat? Well, those who achieved the revolution in the first place.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and he was basically hung out, and he's lost
Oh,
he's
yeah.
lost a lot of economic and even relationships. I find it amazing that like people whose career he built basically through things like Father Ted and the IT crowd
Oh,
now,
yeah.
and
Because
to this
a
they
lot
won't
of
they
this
won't even
prestige,
acknowledge him. you know.
yeah, because again, my theory is that what is the major currency at the moment, and that is prestige, symbolic capital.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a great point to wind down. I'm just gonna because we've done about 2 hours, so I don't want to go on too long, and I think we'll be doing another stream at some point in the soon the future. Anyway, I can
And
see there's plenty of teams to discuss here, but I did ask for comments, and I'm just checking the various things here. So I've got a couple of people watching on Rumble, and is there one on Odyssey? Is there? Maybe no. There's no comments there, but there are on YouTube. The YouTube comments, Linehan Green Fez says Linehan is passionately pro-Israel, somewhat odd. Yeah, he has that kind of British liberal thing, doesn't he?
yeah,
Yeah. I wouldn't agree either personally. And then he also says the flat Earth thing popped up just a few months after Obama mentioned it in a speech. Curious indeed. I don't know if that's true. That's very interesting, and I wouldn't be
Interesting.
surprised. I have always assumed that because of the presence of people like Cass Sunstein in the Obama administration and his prevalence and prominence in various policies and developments, that he's the guy with the nudge, the
Yeah.
nudging, and all that.
Yeah.
And using like he wrote an essay on a concept called cognitive filtration, I think, or infiltration, cognitive infiltration. Um, I think it was in basically in response to the 9/11 truth movement, I believe.
Mm,
And I read it years ago. I think it basically what he says is that you kind of flood the zone could be a
mm,
good strategy, basically. So I think a lot of I think it's potentially likely that he could have had a hand in how things have developed in the conspiracy scene ever since, basically. But I don't know that; it's not for sure.
mm.
So this is just my little conspiracy theory. And last true Gale says David Farrell and Chuck Feeney kicked off the Citizens Assembly stuff. Yeah, indeed. And there's a
Yeah.
whole we could do a whole
That
show on
requires
that.
huge investigation. Yeah. Chuck Beanie, especially.
Yeah, even Feeney is incredible. I've got a whole theory about him. I won't even say it, but you can probably guess what it is. But I think he was a little bit of a front, so to speak.
Yeah.
For capital. Like this kind of stuff happens in all kind of colonies of America. The the money is put into these kinds of fronts. Why would we be any different?
Exactly.
Um, and then someone else, Peace Para says Fabian socialism started in Ireland back in 1848. I don't know what you have any idea what that references. No, I don't. I don't
No, I
personally.
just know is it Beatrice Webb
Yeah,
and
Sydney Webb. Yeah.
Sydney Webb? Yeah. Other than that, I'd have an inkling, but I didn't know it was begun in Ireland. No.
Yeah, I'd love to know if there's some context to that, because I've done a fair bit of research into that as well. And as far as I know, the earliest thing I know about it is that it goes back to like the 80 something or other, I think it is,
Well,
and it
there's
comes
a,
out of a thing called the Fellowship of the New Life, which was a kind
yeah.
of
I mean, even if you look back at the eugenicists with Francis Galton and all these guys, who I think he was related to, what's his name, the evolutionist, Charles Darwin.
yeah.
And Charles Darwin's father was a bit of a eugenicist. And then, of course, you had uh, George Bernard Shaw was a big proponent.
Hmm.
And ultimately, like I think that worldview has just accelerated, if anything, to be
It is,
honest.
yeah, it is that they've developed certain aspects of it, and they've made it
Just
anti-racist.
expanded
So
it. That's
the
all.
comment that I put up yesterday was basically that, like that. The only
Yeah.
thing progressives don't like about eugenics is the racism. It's the only thing. They
That's
like
right.
everything else, like
Yeah.
abortions and all the whole of it. Like,
Yeah.
uh, and then yes, and everyone give the stream a like there, yeah, please, if you would, on whatever format you're looking at it on. We don't not ask for money, but we just if you could help promote the stream, it would be great. Bosco Agra, great to hear you on YouTube. That is from Flooded Cuts 101. I don't know who that is, but if you know them, fair play. Um, and Astro Gale says also, this is from an earlier thing we were saying, but he says also to add to your points there, lads, that's the reason why in the 80s and 90s the civil service could get stuff done, but we can't even build one children's hospital. I think we were referring to the overproduction of elites and the
That's right.
spread of the bureaucracy, basically, which is like it has its own culture and its own, it's just tied down. I remember, you see that civil servant there this week got, he's retired from the Office of Public Works, I think it is. And he has all of these incredible expenses that he just ran up hundreds of thousands every year for, flying around. And like an extreme version. He was the guy that apparently cleared off the bike shed thing in the summer.
No surprise there. But sure, I'd say as well, the bureaucracy and the payments in Brussels, I'd say, are just phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
It's
it is, yeah, and, like, they all queue up for their, like, I mean, it's actually, yeah, I saw a documentary about it years ago. It was made by, I think, the British Eurosceptics, but they were showing, like, all of the bureaucrats basically just not even going into the parliament, just lining up to
yeah,
sign in, like, and just collect this load of expenses on top of that, and then they have an office, and, I mean, yeah, the EU is just a rotten institution, to be honest.
absolutely horrendous. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, and Gale brings up contrarianism. And And Thomas
Yes, that
Ada
is a
also said
major feature of
way
the
too much of that in our circles, and that's probably started off with kind of yeah. Um, Yeah, that's basically it. Adam 12 and TJWK Ireland. Good evening. Yeah, thanks for everyone for what. Let's check X. I don't think people can comment on X. They can have to leave a comment, I think, under the video. Uh,
I'll go back to my obscurity, Don.
yeah, well, I think we got a good audience on X. I can't believe it. We hit 97.
Oh,
So
gee.
surprised about that. That's amazing. Yeah, X is good
Yeah.
for reach. With this, I'm delighted with that. But if people would, if you're on Odyssey, if you're on Rumble, you can, and on Substack, go to my profile and see my linked tree. It has all the different profiles of me, Odyssey, Rumble. My Substack is the main kind of written work. And you have a similar situation. You're on Telegram, Bosco, aren't you? And
Yeah, Saints and Scholars on Telegram, and it's Bosco's Soapbox on Substack.
yeah, I have a link to your Substack page, your this Bosco Substack page, and I have linked the Telegram in the
We
description.
have a YouTube channel, but it's been in hiatus for the last 2 years, to be honest. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think if you probably just start off, maybe it'd be good to
yeah.
stream there. You wouldn't know. You pick up audience there. We picked up a couple tonight now there.
Oh, very good.
So, yeah, I'll thank everyone for listening. I'll be back in a little while. We'll have a guest or we'll have some kind of stream, and have a good night. And
Thank
here
you,
is
Don.
thanks everyone. Yeah, thank you, Bosco. I appreciate it.
Good man.
Take care, everyone.
God bless.